It's a pleasure now to introduce Dr. Paul Wilson to give us a wider academic perspective on how we get health evidence into practice. Paul is a colleague of mine in the University of Manchester who works on what he will explain is implementation science, how we get health evidence into practice, something that other speakers have touched on already this morning. He'll give us an important theoretical, historical, as well as practical framework for what we're trying to do. Paul co-edits the journal Implementation Science, where these kinds of issues are discussed within healthcare internationally. So he has a tremendous perspective for us. Paul, thank you very much for contributing to us.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Or sorry, I should say good morning, everybody. It shows you how many meetings I've been in this morning already. As Jonathan said, I've got implementation in a number of the roles that I hold. I'm based at the University of Manchester in the Centre for Primary Care. And I'm going to talk to you today about the challenges of getting research evidence taken up and used in practice, and how implementation science as a field can offer some solutions in that space. Next slide, please. So before we get on to what implementation science actually is, I thought I'd do some scene setting and just to emphasize that research to practice gaps are not new. And I've gone digging in the literature to find a really old one, and here's one from the 1600s, the story of Lynn's discovery of the preventative value of citrus fruit in scurvy prevention is well known and often taught in school. James Lancaster, who was one of the founders of the East India Company, so a state-sponsored spy pirate in the early 1590s, 1600s, had originally discovered that there was a link between lemon juice in the case of his ships and scurvy prevention. So he had set sail to Sri Lanka with 3 ships, and by the time he got there, he only had enough crew for 1 ship left. Crews that had died were on the ships that didn't have a ration of lemon juice. He noticed that this was the only difference between the ships and wrote back to the Admiralty to say that there was something in this and perhaps we should investigate it further. So another 150 years passed before James Lind actually conducts what's considered to be the first trial of scurvy prevention, so first intervention trial, and published his work in the 1750s. But you'll notice the gap even after the therapeutic effects were established was another 50 years, and even beyond that, looking at the Merchant Shipping Acts, which mandated its use beyond the Royal Navy, is nearly 100 years after that. So I just want you to think about the loss of life that was unnecessary in that time frame for the failure to get known evidence taken up and used in practice. So next slide, please. So moving on to the 1950s, and sort of variations in practice began to rear its head again through something that's known as the diffusion of innovations. This was largely studied in the social sciences, particularly in agriculture in the 1930s and 40s. But in the 1950s, medical sociologists began to take an interest in how ideas and new technologies spread within health systems. And this graph is just a simple demonstration of the uptake and awareness and knowledge of family physicians in the United States. The drug in question is on the slide is listed as Gammamin, but it's actually tetracycline, the antibiotic. So this was its first introduction after its effectiveness has been established as a product. And as you can see, the dotted line are those doctors that are not well connected and less exposed to pharmaceutical marketing, whereas those who are highly connected interact with one another and are also exposed to both pharmaceutical marketing journals and what they call academic detailers in the States, so pharmaceutical reps going out into practice to promote new products. They were far more likely to take up and use this product in practice than those who were less connected. Next slide, please. So this 1950s evidence is highly influential on the development of evidence-based medicine in the 80s and 90s. And with the advent of clinical guidelines that are based on evidence, where the evidence has been synthesized and guideline recommendations are made for practice, there was a huge industry that took off across the world, largely dominated by Europe in the first instance in the late 80s and early 90s. But as people synthesized evidence-based recommendations, they soon realized that actually just pulling together the best practice guidance doesn't necessarily mean that it's enacted in a practice session. So these effective healthcare bulletins, which were produced in the 90s by the then Centre for Reviews and Dissemination at York, who were a sort of early precursor to the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE as it is today, they would disseminate information routinely, but they noticed that there was a challenge in getting recommendations taken up and issued guidance on a couple of occasions to try and promote better uptake. Next slide, please. So this known gap and challenge of implementation led to an infrastructure developing over that time period and until the present day. There's now lots of funding, lots of activity in a field that has become known as implementation science. As Jonathan said right at the start, I edit the sort of what's known as the flagship journal in the field. There are a number of journals that are dedicated to implementation science now, and the field has really exploded in the last 20 years in terms of both grant applications, capacity building in terms of researchers active in the field, but also submissions and outputs for academic publication. Next slide, please. So why is it called implementation science? Well, so-called science, people often say, and actually, when you go digging in the literature, you'll find that prior to the introduction of our journal, implementation science wasn't a term that was used at all. But what it has become is a term that explains an interdisciplinary field of research. The term itself is purely a marketing concept from our publishers, BMC, who, for their purposes, science is a word that sells well in some of their markets. So that's purely where it came, but actually it's become a useful umbrella term to describe a particular type of research. Next slide, please. So this is what it is. We're interested in research examining the uptake of evidence-based healthcare interventions, practices or policies, ways of working, treatments, technologies, into routine practice. We're also interested in stopping things that we know we shouldn't be doing as well. So that's known as de-implementation. And those are usually practices that are long established but are of low or no clinical value. And there are a great many of those throughout the healthcare system where we divert resources into inappropriate care. They are as hard and as challenging to stop people doing something as it is to get them to take something up that's proven and effective. So the field has a number of disciplines within it. Probably the thing that the focus that you most need to know about is that there's a strong focus on professional and organizational change. So whereas effectiveness research tends to focus on patient outcomes, we're very much driven by changing the behavior of health professionals and the organizations in which they work. Next slide, please. So here's just a pathway of the clinical effectiveness research. If I start in the bottom left-hand the corner with the sort of pre-intervention activity, that tends to be research that looks at whether something can work or not, moving through to effectiveness, which is does it work, and then the vast bulk of implementation activity is how can we get this proven intervention taken up and used in practice. And the dark blue box, implementation, is where a lot of the activity and focus of the field is in. Next slide, please. So the dark blue box relates to what we would call strategies. And a lot of the terms on the left-hand column would be very familiar to anybody who works in a health practice setting. We routinely do clinical audits. We're used to attending educational meetings. We're used to having to have reminder systems pop up in our patient management systems telling us to do some things or prescribe particular tests or procedures. All of these are strategies that are examined and evaluated within an implementation science context. We're interested in the things that people do routinely, doing them as efficiently and effectively as possible. So how best to deliver audit and how to deliver feedback to individuals so it does affect their behaviours in terms of how they prescribe or how they refer. These are things that we focus on. Next slide, please. These interventions are often used in conjunction with themselves, so they can become inherently quite complex interventions. And we're often dropping these complex interventions into what are quite complex systems. It's just a schematic of a health system showing there's a lot of stuff going on, and the notion of a linear pathway in terms of developing an intervention and getting it taken up and used in practice is somewhat naive, particularly in complex health systems. Next slide, please. So what we do as implementation scientists is we really have to take a phased approach to getting research taken up and used. So we would start off with identifying areas, priority areas that are agreed with the service. And that's a key feature of implementation science, is that it tends to be service-led. It's not led by researchers who've got an idea of something that they want to do. We tend to respond to underuse and overuse that's recognized within the system, recognized as problems in the areas that need intervention. We routinely apply theory to understand the nature of the interventions and how they're going to be deployed, and to guide the implementation activities that we then undertake and evaluate. We routinely explore the context, the setting in which an intervention is going to be implemented into, and we look at the behaviours and practices that need to be adjusted or enhanced or changed in order for that intervention to be taken up and used. We then develop and refine implementation strategies from the list that I've just shown often, and deploy those in rigorous evaluations, usually big trials, to assess the effectiveness of the strategy. So we're more interested in, does the strategy work, than whether the patient outcomes, they tend to be quite secondary in our world. And most importantly, this last point, understanding mechanisms of change. Next slide, please. So when you have a complex intervention and a complex system and you drop it in and see what happens, essentially understanding the effects that occur takes some unpicking. So this has become an increasingly involved part of implementation science. In clinical effectiveness, people do process evaluations, which is broadly similar, and this is process evaluation guidelines. But in implementation science, really understanding how an intervention has impacted upon a complex system is where a lot of the effort is now concentrated, understanding those mechanisms of change and the active ingredients within an intervention that's allowed it to be taken up and used routinely. So that's all quite hypothetical. Next slide, please. So I thought it would help if I gave you an example, a worked example of some work that we've been involved in here at Manchester. So this is a study that's called Enhancing the Quality of Psychological Interventions Delivered by Telephone. So it's looking at telephone-delivered psychological therapy, delivered mainly through the Improving Outcomes in Psychological Therapy Service, otherwise known as the IAP services that are across the country nationally, and it's funded by NIHR. Next slide, please. So we've identified this as a known area of underuse. So it's again, service-led. Telephone therapy is established, it's highly effective, cost-effective intervention. It's recommended by NICE for mild to moderate anxiety and depression. It is used within the health service, but there's wide variation in how it's enacted and deployed across the IAP services as a whole. Some don't use it at all, some are nearly all telephone-based services. And within that, there have been issues around how patients engage with the system. So next slide, please. So as part of this work, so we recognise it's a known known in terms of underuse, but why that is happening is the first part of the work that we've done. So that's explored the context in terms of the IAT services themselves and the behaviours and practices that act either as enablers and those that do it routinely, and barriers to those who don't do it at all. And doing this work, we've undertaken interviews with service professionals, commissioners, patients themselves, service users, and we've also analysed the actual therapeutic encounter itself, as well as looking at routine data of use. And from that, we've been able to identify some key barriers to uptake. A lot of these are listed here. The key one from a professional perspective is the lack of bespoke training. So people are trained to do face-to-face therapy delivery, but not necessarily trained to use the telephone, and they're very different modes of encounter with a service user. There are all a range of professional beliefs around in terms of how they deliver. They may have been brought up in a face-to-face environment and have a strong preference for delivering therapy in that format. So there needs to be some encouragement and understanding around the relative effectiveness of telephone therapy in that context. There's variable organizational support. So some IAP services work in big call centers, and others you can work from home. And delivering telephone-based therapy is one where you don't want lots of noise in the background. So the way services are configured often influences the way that they can deploy this therapy in practice. There are also expectations of patients. They know people who've had telephone therapy. They may know people who've had face-to-face. They may have had face-to-face themselves in the past. So there's an opportunity there to let people understand and the nature of the treatment regime that's been delivered in this context. And one of the big things in terms of patient engagement has been the information exchange that takes place within the therapeutic encounter. So with a face-to-face encounter, service users are often given homework and workbooks to fill in between each therapy session. There'll be some discussion of the latest rating scales in terms of the depression and anxiety scores. Doing this over the phone is actually quite problematic, and that's a barrier to uptake and use. Next slide, please. So using all that information, we've gone back to our service users, to our professionals, and to our providers and commissioners, and work with them to design an intervention that will hopefully enhance uptake. And as you can see, the key components of that are bespoke training for health professionals, an app has been developed by the University of Manchester to enhance the information exchange so people can see the same data and discuss it without the need for a face-to-face encounter. And we've delivered guidance on to service providers about how they should structure their services in order to enhance their ability to deliver telephone therapy at scale. So the original plan was to rigorously evaluate the effects of this strategy, and that was due to start in October. But because of COVID, obviously these plans have gone on hold, partly through a demand from the system itself to say, we're moving everything online. Can you roll out your training now to everyone? So the team that Manchester, led by Karina Lovell, has pretty much spent the last couple of months doing online training sessions every day for the IAP services across the country. So how we then evaluate that going forward is still something we're discussing with NIHR. We've already given the intervention to all, suggest that we'll have to now adopt a natural experiments model of the evaluation, which will be interesting in itself. But it's interesting that a major pandemic can actually enhance uptake of a proven intervention much quicker than researchers can. Next slide, please. So in summary, I've just given you a flavour of what implementation science is about. It's very much focused on professional and organisational change. It's an evolving interdisciplinary field of research, so we draw from psychology, from sociology, from the health services research, and from other aspects of medicine and health. And that all comes together to better enhance the uptake and use of interventions that we know work. And that's the bottom line for us, is that we're trying to increase the uptake of proven interventions so that ultimately patient care and the efficiency of care is enhanced. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.